This is kind of a weird video, and it's not often I go on rants like this on this channel, but I thought it's an important topic that should be discussed. Recently, you've probably seen the news on what's happening in China, specifically regarding its handling of COVID-19 and its lockdown restrictions. In case you've been living under a rock over the past few weeks or so, there have been protests in multiple cities in China, such as Shanghai, following multiple years of lockdown restrictions and a recent apartment fire that killed 10, in which rescue efforts were hindered by COVID restrictions. Props to these people, as it's incredibly scary to protest in China considering what happened in Tiananmen Square. That's heavily censored in China, so we don't talk about that. Now, you've probably heard rumors on how bad restrictions in China have been over the last 3 years, but you probably don't know specifics as to how they were carrying out and how tightly controlled the population actually was. For example, even just being in a location near someone who was later tested positive will get you locked down in your home. You are physically barricaded in your apartment, and any attempts to leave will trigger an alarm that alerts authorities. And when I mean barricaded, I really mean it, as that's what happened to a friend of mine who currently lives in China. And if you're in a position where you can't be locked in an apartment, there are facilities around in which you will be required to quarantine. Some actually are very nice, but some not so ideal in its living conditions. And as a reminder, this is just if you've been near an area where someone else tested positive, even if you yourself don't show any symptoms. During quarantine, public health workers will come to your home every single day for up to 2 weeks to PCR test you. That's right, even if you're testing negative or not even showing symptoms, you have to be quarantined for the entire 2 weeks, which is just ridiculous, since it's not going to take you that long to turn positive, assuming you've been infected. Now, I get my information from a few sources from my friends and family, but it's possible that in other cities or rural areas, things are done slightly differently, but that doesn't take away from the main point on how harsh these lockdowns are. Okay, so for those of you who know me, you've probably heard me encourage safety measures against COVID-19. For example, social distancing, wearing masks, and of course, various forms of lockdowns. And lockdowns have prevented a lot in terms of costs, because sick people can't work, the cost of healthcare, and of course the monetary value of each lost life. So don't get me wrong, I'm not saying lockdowns are always bad, but like everything there should be moderation. But okay, ignoring that, the bigger issue in my opinion is that you have to have a plan for reopening. When you have such strict lockdowns for 3 years, there are lots of things to consider on what you're eventually going to do, because I think we can all agree that you can't do this forever. Eventually you'll have to open up either partially or fully, and if you don't have a plan in advance, it's not going to go well. And that's pretty much what's happening. China has been relaxing the restrictions, although slightly, indicating they're starting to head in that direction. Quarantining at home is now possible after testing positive, relaxation of PCR testing for domestic travel, and various health codes have been pulled back. I'm not sure if these are truly in response to the protests, but either way it's happening, so we should be looking ahead as to what comes next. One of the main concerns by experts right now is that the immunity levels in China is incredibly low. China will experience essentially what all other countries experienced in the initial spikes of COVID. In a population of 1.4 billion, before they've been experiencing usually around 100 to 200 cases per day only, which is so incredibly low. So you can imagine that there's only really a handful of people that have some sort of immunity right now, and that might not even be against Omicron, which is the fastest spreading strain right now. So we're going to see a relaxation of lockdowns followed by a huge spike in COVID infections with many deaths incoming. And we've seen how fast COVID can spread, especially amongst people without any sort of immunity. And that's exactly what we've seen recently, with more to come. So with that being said, what can China do and what should have they done? I can think of two main things. First, hospitals need to be better prepared. There's already a flood of patients that are beginning to overwhelm hospitals, and some reporting a shortage of drugs and treatment supplies. In addition, because there are so many people in China, doctors are often overwhelmed as well. Even on a regular basis, doctors are sometimes encouraged to give wrong treatments to people, such as antibiotics to treat viral infections, in order to get that patient through to see the next one, due to the sheer number of patients. I made a video on this before, so check it out if you haven't already. To prepare for surge in cases, China should have had better preparation by supplying hospitals better, increasing organizational efforts, stocking up on drugs and oxygen, etc., in order to offset the upcoming blow. And that hasn't really been done effectively so far, which means people are going to suffer and hospitals will overflow with people, which if not controlled properly will lead to greater infection rates within hospitals as well. That's number one. Number two, China could have also reduced the blow by providing better vaccinations and encouraging efforts to vaccinate the elderly. The vaccines available in China have been entirely optional for so long, which I find to be incredibly weird. Not saying that you should make it mandatory, but a country that has so much control over its people, enforcing incredibly strict lockdowns and quarantine measures, for some reason made their vaccines optional. That being said, although many people in China are indeed vaccinated, booster shots are lagging incredibly behind. Not just regular boosters, but also boosters to counter new strains. But the elderly have an incredibly low vaccination rate as well, which will contribute to more deaths during reopening. But that's not even where the problem ends. China also currently only provides 2 vaccines, both of which were developed in China, Sinopharm and CoronaVac. And look, I don't mean to shit on these vaccines, but the point of having joint international efforts in developing multiple vaccines even after the first one is so that we can develop ones that are better, cheaper, or more convenient. And I'm sorry to say that we have better options than Sinopharm and CoronaVac, which by the way both uses an inactive virus instead of the mRNA technology. One thing I just did not really understand is why China didn't purchase vaccines from overseas such as Pfizer or Moderna and provide that to the people, since it has a significantly higher efficacy rate and also includes updated boosters to fight against new Omicron substrains. These vaccines, along with their boosters, should have been provided way earlier on, but instead we're here where much of the population are not updated with their vaccine immunity, especially the elderly, on a vaccine that is subpar compared to what's available out there. Now, you're probably thinking, oh, China will basically just experience a lesser version of what would have happened 3 years ago if they didn't have lockdowns, essentially the same as what all other countries experienced. So what's the difference? Well, the difference is that this could have been avoided 3 years later, and we've learned a lot about the virus and how to respond to it. We've developed new technologies, especially the vaccines, which are readily available. But yet, China continued to lock their civilians down, which isn't the main criticism here, but also didn't have a clear plan going forward on how to mitigate the inevitable spread of the virus once you begin relaxing COVID rules. We can all agree that you can't have such strict lockdowns forever. You'll eventually have to open up, and when that happens, you have a very incredibly dense population of people to think about. Just look at another country with a similar population, India, and you know that you're fighting an uphill battle here. So the proper response would have been to plan in advance and how you're going to control the spread. There are multiple things that you could have worked on, such as the two I mentioned earlier, with supplying and organizing hospitals better, as well as an early effort to vaccinate your people with better vaccines. But yet, from what I see at least, China has been so focused on their strict lockdowns for so many years that they didn't have enough foresight to see this coming. And that sucks for everyone in China. My family is in China, and they have no option but to follow along with what's to come, since any criticism or even advice to the Chinese government will be met with censorship. So what's the point of this video? This was basically just a roundabout way of saying that the fight against COVID is clearly not over, and China is an example of it. We could be facing a new strain at any moment, and even starting now in the United States, we're seeing a steady increase of a new wave. But as time passes, the more I am inclined to believe that we truly did not learn anything from COVID, and until we give up that pride, this war will never be over. Thank you to everyone for watching, and thank you to Fireshard, Alan Morton, Miss Fixit, and Edward Martin for the continuous support of this channel. I'll see you all in the next one.